Okay, welcome back. Hope you enjoyed your lunch. I could see some animated conversations going on at the tables. This next segment is now looking at a couple of teacher preparation programs based at universities. I hesitate to call them traditional programs because that makes it seem like they're not moving forward, so I won't call them that, but they're programs based at universities. And first we'll have Julie Cohen speaking about the program at the University of Virginia.
Hi, my name is Julie Cohen. I'm an assistant professor of curriculum and instruction at the University of Virginia. And it's been really exciting to hear the talks this morning and to think about the ways in which and the degree to which our program at UVA is in fact distinct from and similar to the programs that we just heard about this morning. So give you a little bit of sense of how I think about our program and the context in which we think about our program. So there has been a kind of increased body of research that makes clear that teachers are the single most important school-based lever for improving student outcomes. And when I say student outcomes, I mean outcomes really broadly. So cognitive, non-cognitive outcomes, short-term outcomes, long-term outcomes. We also know that teachers are learning a lot on the job, given these really steep gains to experience that we see as teachers move into the field as teachers of record. And so this is kind of beg the question in the general discourse and for us at Curry about the degree to which teacher preparation matters. In particular, what's the value added of doing teacher preparation in the context of a research university? There are a number of critiques, many of which are going to be familiar to the people in this room, but they've included low standards for admissions, something we've talked about a lot this morning, that the focus really is on theory. There's this ivory tower complex where we're really disconnected from the work that's happening in the field. And that we have weak content-specific preparation for our candidates. So at Curry, we've tried to address these challenges, these kinds of general critiques in a number of different ways. And to give you a sense of who we are and our program history, this is a very established program. We've been preparing teachers for 100 years. It's a relatively mid-sized program. About 150 candidates move through our program each year. And we have elementary, secondary, and special education cohorts. We have a 2-year post-grad program and a 3-year joint Bachelor's of Arts, Master's of Teaching program that's designed for UVA undergrads in the College of Arts and Sciences. And when we try to articulate the value of a specific program, I think Bob pushed us to start with the program goals, and I think that is a really important and helpful place to start, because it's hard to kind of make a case about whether a program is effective or not unless we have clarity around what effectiveness means in a specific context and how we know someone is effective at their practice. And in particular at UVA, we, not unlike the programs that Arthur and Emily described this morning, are really focused on developing competencies in teachers. When we think about what we're trying to cultivate in our candidates, it's high-quality instructional practices. And we've articulated those in these kind of broad bins, and I'll talk more about the kinds of details of how we think about doing this work and moving our candidates towards successful, competent practice. I do want to orient you to this phrase, well-launched novices, because I think there is a developmental aspect to this. And so when we think about gains to experience, I think there always are going to be gains to experience. That's developmental. But we're trying to position our candidates as well as we can so they're as ready as they can be to engage in high-quality practice from day one. So a big part of the work that we do and how we kind of help our candidates reach these goals around these core competencies is by organizing our program around what I think of as a language of practice. And so Emily and Arthur talked about using Danielson as a starting point for doing that similar work in my mind. And we use a different observation system that articulates different kinds of competencies and practices, and that's the classroom assessment scoring system, or the CLASS. This is a different standardized, reliable observation protocol that's been used in a number of different research studies. It was developed by our dean, Bob Pianta, and has been kind of refined and studied over time by researchers in his shop, Castle. So we are, I think, one of the few programs that's actually using this tool, not just to evaluate teachers, but actually to support their development in the early stages. So class, which I'll tell you more about so you can get a sense of what it looks like and how we use it. There are a number of different scales, and these scales are designed to measure different aspects of quality practice. They're mapped onto the core competencies that I oriented you to at the beginning, but also onto the Virginia Department of Ed standards for professional practice. So there are a lot of strengths to using a kind of common language in a framework, but I think first and foremost, it gives us coherence and clarity as a faculty about what effective teaching should look like in our context. So the class is foregrounds, I think above all things, teacher-student interactions. This is a tool that was developed by developmental psychologists, where the focus really is on the warmth of the relationships that teachers cultivate with students and that students cultivate with each other. And it really is a particular kind of lens into thinking about instructional quality. So there are three broad kind of factors or bins of elements in the class. So emotional support is pretty self-evident. It focuses on the kind of climate the teacher establishes, the degree to which the teacher has regard or recognizes student perspectives, student contributions. Classroom organization looks at management and productivity, maximizing instructional time. And instructional support looks at things like feedback and the quality of the instructional dialogue that teachers provide. So I can't go into depth about all of these kinds of different scales and what they measure, but just to give you a sense of one of them. So this is the scale for productivity, and this falls into the kind of organizational domain that I just mentioned. I do want to note that I do think things like Jack talked about a do now on the board, things like that would be captured in a productivity scale. So teachers doing things that I think kind of go beyond tricks or quick techniques, teachers actually maximizing instructional time by having something like a do now on the board so that kids come in, they have something to do, they're not sitting at their desks waiting for instructions to start. Those kinds of techniques would be assessed in this productivity scale. And it is not a theoretical or lacking an empirical basis. So I think we have a lot of evidence that time on task is probably the most consistent predictor of student outcomes. So I think it is, something that we make clear to the candidates. This isn't something we pulled out of thin air. This is based on a lot of data from a lot of different classrooms that using instructional time in a maximally efficient way matters a lot for kids. Candidates are then scored on the scale as a whole, 1, 2 low, up through 6, 7 high. The candidates receive these scales, and I'll tell you more about how we do that. But they have real clarity around how high quality and low quality practice is scored and what kinds of indicators we look for when we think about quality practice. So how do we get them there? If this is the tool that we use to assess them and how we think about whether or not we've reached our goals, what are we doing kind of along the way to get them to a place where we would expect that they would be able to engage in high quality practice? So specific dimensions, practices are introduced throughout our coursework, which I'll tell you more about in a minute. We also have access, and I think one of the benefits of being at a research institution is we have access to this pretty comprehensive library that the Research Center Castle has cultivated over their years of using this tool in research studies. So we have all different examples of what a highly productive classroom, for example, looks like. So we can give our candidates all different kinds of concrete representations of that practice, both high and low quality. Talk about troubleshoot in a classroom that may score low on productivity. What kinds of strategies could we use to help candidates use instructional time more productively in that kind of video? These scales have also become, I think, a really helpful common lens for observing, reflecting, talking about the work of teaching. And they're a shorthand for discussing teaching amongst each other. So it's not uncommon to hear our candidates refer in a kind of shorthand way to, oh, my teacher has high regard, which is one of the class scales, or my mentor teacher is so productive. And that kind of language evokes something common, I think, in the minds of our candidates. So again, our coursework, I think, really has tried to address this critique of university programs, that they're really theory heavy. We have almost no theoretical coursework at all. The vast majority of our courses are methods courses, which I think makes sense given our goals, which really are around instructional practice. So we have a pretty robust method sequence in elementary and secondary. Elementary candidates take a full 3-course sequence in literacy, given the amount of instructional time dedicated to literacy in Virginia elementary schools. We also have a whole set of general methods courses that all our candidates take. So these focus on, again, I would argue kind of competency-based aspects of teaching, things like providing high-quality feedback or managing classrooms productively and efficiently, generating coherent lesson plans that align with learning objectives, those kinds of things. Because we also want our candidates to have consistent opportunities to practice and apply the things we're talking about in our methods coursework, they're in clinical experiences throughout. And you don't need to digest all of this. But the kind of big takeaways are that throughout the program, either 2 years for postgrads or 3 years for our undergrads, they're engaged in clinical experiences every step of the way. And we use a kind of gradual release of responsibility method where they start by just tutoring individual kids. But even in those tutoring experiences, they get a ton of very specific feedback. So they are working with a struggling reader using very scripted lesson plans. They videotape all of those interactions with kids and get feedback from people who work in our reading clinic on their practice, on the ways they engage learners, on the ways they capitalized on what kids know. Over time, they're taking on more and more responsibility, where the mentor teacher is gradually releasing the responsibility to them, working with small groups, and then eventually full-time student teaching, where they're taking lead responsibility over all aspects of the classroom for half of a semester. And then in the past 3 years, we've been trying something that I think is pretty exciting, where we're not only using class as kind of our language of practice in terms of assessment and in terms of coursework, but we're also using it as a coaching tool in these field experiences. And so my teaching partner, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is a professional development coaching tool that's designed to complement the class. Again, it was designed by researchers at Castle. There's a lot of empirical evidence that suggests it's really helpful in leveraging student outcomes. And this is the first time that someone's tried to use it in a pre-service context. So we were able to work with the researchers at Castle to think about how we would modify this tool for a pre-service context. Again, I think we're capitalizing on many of the same principles that Emily, for example, highlighted, that teachers need to be actively engaged in the professional development and the coaching. And I'll tell you more about what that looks like in just a minute. So again, throughout this cycle, class is the language of practice. When we engage teachers in the My Teaching Partner cycle, we're describing and talking about teaching using the language of class, which again has become familiar to them kind of throughout the program. So the way that the cycle works is the candidate submits a lesson plan. This is pretty typical. The supervisor evaluates the lesson plan using the language of class to tag specific moments in the lesson plan. They then video record themselves enacting the plan. That is then uploaded onto a common server. The university supervisor watches those lessons and tags very small instances. So maybe 30 seconds where teachers engaged in high quality management practices, or 2 minutes where they're providing high quality feedback, 1 minute where the teacher kind of misses an opportunity to pick up and capitalize on a kid's perspective on some issue. So again, there's this tagging and then talking about what has been tagged using the language of class to describe things that were strong about the candidate's practice as well as things that they might be struggling with and need to work on. The intern then gets all of that back, reviews it, thinks about the prompts that the supervisor has asked them to think about, reflects on what they've done. They then have a conference, the kind of traditional triad that we talk about a lot in teacher ed, where the mentor teacher the supervisor and the candidate meet together, but they have this kind of shared referent. They have the video that's been tagged, so the conversations, I think, become much more focused. So instead of just talking about, well, how did that go? Which is, at least when I was trained as a teacher, how all of my meetings went. And so you kind of avoid those generalities by honing in on really specific moments. The candidate then thinks about the conference, what was discussed. They go back, they write a summary and an action plan for next steps. So again, the candidate is actively engaged throughout. They're being asked to reflect on their own instruction, think critically about their own instruction at every step of the way. Just to give you a sense of the kinds of prompts we use, some of them are fairly obvious, nice work. You could guess what that prompts them to do. But things like making the most of instructional support. That's a prompt that for them, they know they're going to get feedback that's sort of pushing them to think differently about how they could kind of better scaffold students towards whatever their learning goal is. Again, I think the goals of this are pretty clear. It allows us to kind of capitalize on this common language that we've worked hard to cultivate and to reinforce that language, to make it the language of not just our university, but of the field as well. It allows all of the kind of constituents in our program to speak the same language. So it's allowed us to kind of bring mentor teachers into the dialogue in a different kinds of way. So rather than class just being our language, it's the shared language, and something that the teachers in our community are pretty familiar with. It gives candidates opportunities to kind of think about their own strengths and their challenges. And again, as I've said, I think it reinforces the triad in a powerful way by giving this sense of a shared referent. I do think it's helped us kind of bridge the university and the field divide that we talk about a lot in teacher ed. And I think my last point is cut off, but I think I remember it. But I think also, really importantly, we are a research university with a lot of people who are interested in this as a research area. And so we have a tremendous and ever-growing kind of record of candidates' practice over time. And I do think this is really powerful for us because a lot of us want to study this and use it as a research tool so that we can understand and then improve our program. I want to make clear, because I think this is a very common critique of competency-based work in general, that there are limits to this. And I don't think anyone in our program thinks that we've discovered some sort of panacea that's going to make teaching better everywhere. Whenever you give candidates a set of rubrics, I think it becomes very easy for them to think this is some sort of recipe for doing good teaching. That is not how I conceive of it, and I don't think that's how anyone in our program conceives of it. We're not trying to give them some sort of algorithm to teach well. The class is a means to this much broader and more amorphous end of good teaching, which I do think takes varied forms and varied contexts and is responsive to context. Instead, I see the class scales, and any kinds of scales in general, they're just scaffolds. They're just tools to kind of help candidates understand and decompose something that's really, really complicated. And I think that they're helpful for that purpose. Again, when we think about our goals, we're preparing well-launched novices. These are people who are not experts. And when they enter our program, some of our candidates are 19 years old. The only access they've had to the work of teaching is from being a student. And so having this kind of framework to think about and decompose and break apart something so complicated, I think is powerful and helpful. How that translates into their practice down the road is something that we can't yet understand, which I will talk about more in a minute. Anytime you try to standardize things at a university, there are challenges and resistance. And I think this is something where our program is going to be different from a program that exists outside of a university context. You need different kind of consensus and buy-in, I think, when you start in the context of an existing program with faculty who have specific interests. So when you use any kind of tool, it's just a lens. And any kind of lens is going to foreground things and marginalize things. When we talk about core competencies, there are things that are perceived of as less core. And there's a lot of discussion in our faculty about what that does and how that positions people and kids. In particular, this tool, again, as I said, was developed by developmental psychologists who have a particular frame for thinking about instruction. Things are not emphasized at all in the class that I think all of us think are quite important. So for example, culturally responsive teaching is something that's not captured really at all. Content-specific aspects of instruction, which many of us, in particular those of us who teach in the secondary program, feel are quite important. Those things are not discussed at all in class. So there are trade-offs. We have a lot of faculty meetings about whether or not we should add additional protocols. My personal view is that something like teaching is so complicated that you could keep adding and adding and adding. That's maybe how Michigan State got to 1,500 competencies. And I do think there are downsides to that too, right? You're gonna end up muddying the benefits of something like this, which is the kind of coherence and clarity that it provides. So as we think about data-driven teacher ed in our context, it's not just the data we collect from the class, but we've also been working really hard to build a more comprehensive and longitudinal database about our candidates. So using the Teachers for a New Era money, we developed something called the Curry Participant Pool, which allows us to collect survey data and other kinds of data about our candidates throughout the course of the program. Right now, it includes things, again, because this was developed by psychologists, not unsurprisingly, things like attitudes about children, teacher self-efficacy, multicultural attitude scale. We've just recently formed a faculty data committee that is going to think hard and critically about how we can kind of capitalize on having a system like this. So we're talking about adding all sorts of additional measures to this existing database. And then being able to look at, say, for example, how candidates do on specific assignment, whether or not that predicts their class scores down the road. So really thinking sort of more comprehensively about what kinds of data we want about candidates and how to include those in our system. And so finally, I was thinking about Arthur when I looked back at this slide. So there is a platform for virtual classrooms, and it's developed by a group called Mersion. And it does allow us, I think, to start bridging coursework and fieldwork, and we've just begun using it in our program and our classroom management courses. But I do think it gives us this opportunity, because even though we have very purposeful clinical experiences throughout, the methods instructors are not always in the field. So for example, I teach a methods course, but I never go out into the field and see my candidates enact their practice because there are 75 of them, and that would be logistically daunting. But I can watch them engage in 5-minute sort of experiences, structured experiences in a simulator, and give them highly structured feedback on that. So that's something we're going to start using increasingly in the course of our program, and again, to design very purposeful tests of whether or not there are specific structures for this that are maximally effective for our candidates. When we think about the benefits of doing this at a research university, I do think having people down the hall, to use the kind of comment from this morning, who do research, who think about research, who do research on teaching and teacher education, it's invaluable. And we've really been able to capitalize on this with the synergy with CASEL. And to be able to use their tools that they've studied very comprehensively to think about when they work, why they work, how they work. It gives us a different kind of access and perspective than we would have otherwise. It gives us also access to people in the College of Arts and Sciences and schools of engineering, and as we develop new programs, having those disciplinary experts kind of consult with us and think about what kinds of skills engineering teachers need has been kind of invaluable. I also think it's important to note the value of doctoral students, because I really do think that's something unique and really, really important. So having this whole new generation of teacher educators and teacher education researchers there to give you a fresh perspective, often a perspective that's much closer to the field than your own, I think is really important. And having those new perspectives, hundreds of dissertations have come out of our program about our program. And having those perspectives, I think, does change things in an important way. It's not all roses at UVA, and there are definitely challenges. So in particular, and I think Diana's going to speak to a very different context in North Carolina, but when we think about looking at how our candidates develop these competencies over time, we really have limited access to the kinds of sources of evidence we would need to understand that. Without kind of access to longitudinal data about our candidates, and I'm not talking about student achievement data, more in terms of how they're doing in classrooms, it's hard to know. And then it's hard to think about how we refine our program. We also don't have the same capacity to differentiate and tailor our experiences in the way that Arthur and Emily do, just because of the kinds of scheduling and logistical demands of doing a program at a university. It's harder to get faculty to rally around a common idea. These are things that have been well documented in the literature, so I don't need to belabor. I do think as we think about moving the conversation forward, I think that this has been alluded to this morning, but when we think about building a culture of evidence and a culture of data and teacher preparation, we need to think hard and talk more deeply about what constitutes evidence and what kinds of evidence we need to make the claims we want to make about our programs. And when we think about the range of outcomes that we care about, we need a lot more data sources. We need a lot more kinds of data. And again, this necessitates partnerships with districts, with states, and I think we're not there yet. But I'm hopeful because I think that we're moving in that direction. And to come back to Jack's point, I do think we're making progress over time in thinking about these challenges and how to navigate them. Thank you.